the Illinois Disciples Foundation a little bit before we get started here. Thank you all for coming out. This is the Illinois Disciples Foundation Activist Forum, which is one of our... Exactly 40 years ago this month, I was on the island of Taiwan in the process of getting kicked out of the U.S. Naval Security Group, which I had been working with for a couple of previous years. And so I thought one way to kind of open this up would be to say, okay, how did I get into the Naval Security Group by 1964, and how was I getting kicked out of it? And then what have I been doing since then? So I'm going to try to kind of put some lines of my life together in this way, and hopefully, if there are any questions that come out of this, you can ask them, and I'll answer everything that I can. I was born in Chicago in 1942, in December 1942. Born and raised on the west side of Chicago. Anybody who's familiar with Chicago, the Austin district is where my family lived. Cicero Avenue, Van Buren Street, that area. My parents are both, I come from a working class family. My father was a factory worker for the Hawthorne plant in Cicero for about 40 years. My mother worked during the Second World War when my father was drafted. My mother worked in the defense plant up in Wisconsin. She later, when we moved back to Chicago, she was working in a factory in Chicago. And so I have a pretty serious working class background. I mentioned that my dad was in World War II. He was drafted at the age of 28 in 1944 when I was 2 years old, and he served in the Battle of the Bulge and ended up coming out of that with some pretty serious psychological wounds, which didn't show up until maybe like 10 or so years ago, where he started drifting off and talking about things that he had never talked about with us. As a Vietnam veteran, I'm particularly sensitive to those kinds of things, and I recognize there was a lot about my dad that I didn't know, and hopefully we'll get to know more before too long. The family is mixed in many ways. My father comes from a Polish Catholic background. Family was pretty hardcore Democrat, which was kind of what you were in Chicago in those days. My mother comes from an English-German Presbyterian background, Republican. So if you want to talk about mixed marriages, I'm a product of mixed marriage. We had some interesting times in those early family years. I remember my mother having to throw her own father out of our house because of a political argument that he and my dad got into. Some of those things just kind of stick with you. I was raised Roman Catholic. Again, in those days, if one of the partners in the marriage was Catholic, the non-Catholic partner had to agree that the children would be raised Catholic. Therefore, my sister and I were raised Roman Catholic. Went to Catholic grammar school from kindergarten all the way through 8th grade. And then by an accident of history, I managed to escape and go to a public high school, which actually saved me, I think. Unlike people like Jeff, who got stuck with high school and all that stuff. Growing up in the 40s and the 50s was, for anybody who wasn't there, was a pretty intense period. Being raised Catholic during the height of hardcore Catholicism and the Cold War, which kind of went together. The anti-communism and the Catholicism was a pretty tight bond that you grew up with. And so anyone who grew up during that period, you're pretty much pro-mainstream, pro-military, anti-communism hardcore, and the world was pretty well situated in black and white terms. It was us versus them. And particularly for Catholics, it was us versus everybody. One of the things that I think has served to inform me or maybe cause me to begin questioning things at a fairly early age, not in a radical way, but in a kind of quiet way, was the fact that my mother was non-Catholic, And here we were in Catholic schools in the 40s and 50s being told that if you weren't Catholic, you were going to hell. So my sister and I were terrified. My sister's 4 years younger than me. We were terrified. We thought our mother was going to go to hell because she wasn't Catholic. And we used to give her a lot of grief about why she wasn't like us. And we didn't really think about that too much. But part of the situation also during that period for me, again, 40s and 50s, because of the political mix in the family, because of the religious mix in the family, and because of the period objectively, there were things that were taking place that were beginning to cause little cracks in the monolith, so to speak. I was influenced by a lot of things. I was influenced by TV. I was influenced by comic books. Comic books in that period, that was a pretty intense form of entertainment for a lot of us. And you wouldn't necessarily know that comic books were seen as a very dangerous medium at that time. There was a conservative element in this country that saw comic books as basically the devil's work, and that they were going to ruin all of us, and they passed all of these comic book codes, so the comic books had to kind of meet those codes, and a lot of comic books ended up going out of business. One comic book, however, that saved a lot of us, started off as a comic book and ended up becoming a magazine, was Mad. I know Paul was going with that one. Mad comic book started in 1952 when I was 10 years old, and I remember it as a 10-cent comic book that made fun of everything. Everything we took seriously they made fun of. They became a magazine in 1955 because that saved them from having to follow the comic book code. So they were able to be even more satirical and vicious in many ways than they might have been otherwise. Now that may not seem like a big thing, but in the 1950s, particularly about 1955, the height of McCarthyism, the anti-communism, everything was a threat to us. Everything was evil. Having a magazine like that as a kid was one kind of element of escape that you could have, and they laughed at everything. Jeff Machota, some of you know Jeff, and his partner Claudia Lenhoff bought me this book, Mad About the 50s. It's a collection of some of the 50s things, and they gave me this in 1997. I found this the other day. I thought, shit, I got to bring this along because there's stuff in here, Super Duper Man. There's jokes about the Lone Rangers as the Lone Stranger, all this kind of stuff, which sounds kind of silly, but for that period, these were things that helped us kind of break through a lot of the crap that was going on around us. So you need to have that kind of framework. Also, something about the 50s, and again, as I said, there were mixed messages. I grew up in a pro-military family, a pro-union family. One of my heroes was General Douglas MacArthur, because I didn't know any better. And I remember things like him, when he was fired by Truman in 1951, there was a big welcome-home parade for him. I was appalled that Truman would fire my hero when I watched that parade on TV. Now, you wonder about some of these things. 1954, the Under God line was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. The Pledge of Allegiance did not exist from time immemorial, folks, regardless of what people might tell you. Pledge of Allegiance is a fairly recent thing. They added Under God in 1954 as a result of the anti-communist stuff and all of the stuff that was being thrown at us. And those of us in Catholic schools at that time saw that as a great victory. We had a big party at our school, at our grammar school. That was also the year I remember writing letters to a man by the name of Mao Zedong, Chinese leader. All we knew about him was that he was an evil Chinese communist. The nuns had us write these letters to him, pleading with him to release the American POWs. This is when we were in 6th grade, I think it would have been 6th grade. These are, those little things that kind of inform you. So the 50s for me, at least that early part of the 50s, before I got into high school basically, was a series of events that were kind of molding me in a certain way, but at the same time preparing me for questioning later on. Now, you don't recognize this at the time. A lot of this stuff comes up later. When I got into high school, as I said, I went into public high school, and this was Austin High School on the west side of Chicago. Same high school my mother went to, by the way. This was largely, well, it was basically an all-white school. We had 2 black students, as I remember, in 1958. And 1 male, 1 female. The male was constantly being harassed by most of the students at the school. He was almost beat up in the parking lot one day, except a group of white senior students. I was a sophomore at the time. White senior students went out and protected him and brought him back into the building. Those 2 students didn't stay in that school very long. We didn't have many black families in the neighborhood. Why? Because if they moved west of, at that time, Kedzie Avenue, which was the line, if they moved west of Kedzie, they were under threat. Their apartment buildings would be hit with rocks and bottles and black paint. I remember splashes of black paint on apartment buildings around our neighborhood when black families would try to move in. That didn't make sense to me. I was raised by my family. My family was not raising me to be a racist. My family was raising me to believe in freedom and equality and justice, fair play for everybody. And so these formal messages didn't fit with the reality that was around us. And I didn't see anybody doing anything about it except complaining about the black families trying to move in. And that bothered a lot of us during that time. So the mid to late 50s for me was already recognizing some of the holes in the fabric that we were being taught. Along with that, you have rock and roll. Can't talk about growing up in the 50s without talking about rock and roll. So if you link Mad Magazine up with Elvis Presley and Bill Haley and the Comets and Chuck Berry and all of that, we were beginning to make some noise about the deadness around us. And everybody participated in this in one way or another. Interesting little sidelight, my introduction to rock and roll actually came from my mother. She didn't realize it at the time. She was taking me to see a Glenn Ford movie, Blackboard Jungle, in 1955. What was the theme song for Blackboard Jungle? Rock Around the Clock, Bill Haley and the Comets. That was my first exposure to rock and roll music. And from there, it's downhill. Then Elvis comes next year. These are music and comics and political issues that were beginning to bubble up, begin to kind of set the framework for things that happen later. Rock and roll becomes boring very quickly, actually. Once capitalism decided they could make money off of it, it starts getting whiter and whiter and schlockier and schlockier. It was less interesting. By this time I was taking drum lessons and thought I would be a rock and roll drummer. Then I realized how boring rock and roll drumming was, at least in those days. So I got interested in jazz. You get interested in jazz, you follow on, and you pay attention to, at that time, mainly black musicians who were producing the most interesting music. So some of my heroes were jazz drummers like Philly Joe Jones. I don't know if anybody's familiar with him. This is while I was in high school, there was an all-ages club in Chicago called the Birdhouse. It was on Division Street, down near State Street. And you could go there and mainstream jazz acts like Cannonball Adderley Quintet, Miles Davis played there, Donald Byrd played there, Duke Ellington played there. You could go in there, pay $1.50, and sit for as long as you want until they closed at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, listening to mainstream acts. And I would do this. I would get on the bus, Cicero Avenue bus to Division down to State, and go and sit there and pay my $1.50 and watch these great acts. That would, by this time I'm 17, and I was that was a whole different world to me. Those were my heroes. Then I joined the Navy. Now, why do you join the Navy? If the world is if you're being asked questions and things like this. I joined the Navy because, first of all, I didn't want to join the Army. That was one big reason. My dad was in the Army. All of my male relatives were in the Army. And I thought, what the hell, I'll break the mold. And I joined the Navy. Plus, joining the Navy seemed to give me a little bit more options for choosing what I might want to do. At least I thought so. Joined the Navy in April of 1961, at the age of 18. We all had a 6-year military obligation at that time. People don't remember that necessarily unless you were from that period. All 18-year-old healthy males that didn't have some kind of deferment, you had a 6-year military obligation. And people would mix it up in various ways. Some guys would go in for 2 years active duty and then come out and have 4 years reserve time. Some people like me and my friends would go into the Navy or the Air Force for 4 years, or the Marines for 4 years, and come out and do 2 years reserve time. So I chose to go into the Navy at this point, thinking I was going to become a journalist. That was my plan, to be a Navy journalist, and then go and work for a newspaper. Again, probably because of this whole notion of there's got to be more about the world than what's in Chicago at that time, and things needed to be better in some vague sense. Went to Great Lakes boot camp, and in the boot camp they told me, well, she would like to send you to journalism school, but you don't know how to type. I didn't know how to type. I never took typing in high school. I mean, just to escape that torture. And so they said, well, why don't you become a radio man? I had good scores in my radioman tests in basic. Radioman didn't sound too exciting to me. Then he came up with this vague sounding title, communications technician. And he read from a piece of paper. It was kind of like a stock description of what this thing was, which didn't say anything, which was kind of attractive. Wow, this is, I don't know what this is, but it sounds like it could be cool. So I went for communications technician. After basic training, I finished in July of 1961. I was sent to my first service school, which was in Bainbridge, Maryland, and that was where they were going to teach me how to do communications technicians work for personnel. Now, all I knew about communications technician was that it was part of the intelligence agencies in the Navy. We didn't know a lot of details beyond that because this guy didn't have much on that piece of paper to tell us. And the people that we saw at this school who were in communications technician and had more stripes than we did, we would try to pump them. You know, what are we going to be doing? What are we going to be doing? And they would just kind of smile and wink and nod and, just kind of give you that sense that they had this secret knowledge that you were eventually going to come up against, right? And you were going to find out what you were going to do. That was exciting too. This was kind of like spy stuff. This was very attractive. While I was at that school, I got to take a test for language aptitude, because the possibility was that you might be sent to language school if you passed this test. Now they give this test, I think, to everybody who was in the military, but at that time you had to go through one school before you got the test. Took the test, apparently did well enough in it to volunteer for language school. So I figured, okay, I'll try Russian. They give you 3 choices. Russian, Polish, German were my 3 choices. Russian, I figured that's the enemy, might as well know the enemy's language. I figured that's where they would need people from. Polish, my family background, I never could speak Polish to my grandmother. I thought if I learned Polish, I might be able to talk to my grandmother. German, I took 2 years of German in high school, couldn't remember much beyond Auf Wiedersehen, and I thought maybe I would learn something. And I asked for school in Washington, D.C. Well, 3 weeks later, I get my orders for Chinese Mandarin in California. I was beginning to see a pattern here with the Navy already, that it wasn't always what it seemed. So I was sent to Chinese language school in California. Before I go into that, let me back up just one step to basic training. This kind of fits in with this whole notion of where I was coming from. I saved a lot of letters that I'd sent to my parents over the years. My parents had saved them and they gave them to me. Here's a letter I wrote home from Great Lakes in 1961. This is in May of 1961, just before I was ready to graduate from basic training. Well, folks, we heard some good news and some bad news today. First, the bad news. Cuba is officially communist! Exclamation point. That means that the Reds are now 90 miles from the United States! Exclamation point. And the good news was when I was going to graduate. So, but that was where I was in May of 1961. So now I'm in language school in California. And this experience was, for me, it gave me exposure to a whole new culture. It gave me a chance to experience a little bit more about what the service was about. There was a lot of things I saw pretty early on in the military. The racism in the military, I saw that at Great Lakes. A couple of my friends in our recruit training camp our recruit training company were black, and they didn't really fare too well in the Navy. The Navy is one of the more racist of the military services, at least it was at that time. I don't know much about it now, but I'm assuming it hasn't changed that much. Going to language school was another extension of that. Our language instructors were all native-born Chinese from the mainland. We only had one instructor who was from Taiwan. And we got to learn a lot about China as a culture, China's history, China's politics, while we were learning the language. You can't learn a language effectively without picking those things up. And one of the experiences I was having here at language school was, again, broadening my perspective on the way the world was. Some of these instructors were not all that anti-Chinese communist. They were not very vocal about this, because this was a military base that they were teaching at, the Army Language School in California. But some of them were very broad-minded in terms of talking about their curiosity and their feelings about China. So I began to think about this more broadly myself as a result of that. Also, the fact about Monterey, California, being at that school, that's a fairly, it's an artsy kind of community. Even though there's a huge number of retired military personnel that live there, you can't spend a lot of time in Monterey, at least in those days, you can't spend a lot of time in Monterey without beginning to look into alternative ways of thinking. Again, this is I was there from 61 to 63. And one of the big things that was going on in town there was coffee houses. This was the tail end of the beat movement. A lot of us at the language school at that time, in order to be in the intelligence field, you had to have at least a high school diploma. There were people that I was working with in school that had some college. They tended to be a little bit higher level educational background. A lot of philosophical discussions. Part of the language also kind of exposed you to that. A lot of philosophical discussions in coffee houses, wearing black turtleneck shirts and berets and shit. I mean, these were guys in the military that had haircuts that made it pretty clear what they were. This was a period for me of adding to the questioning, because the more I got into these philosophical questions, the more I started learning about Chinese philosophy. I started reading Zen. There was a book called Zen Catholicism. Talk about wanting it both ways. I was trying to maintain my Catholicism and also become a Zen Buddhist at the same time. So those were things that I was getting into. I was reading a magazine which disappeared, I think, in 1973, called the Evergreen Review. Stuff, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, all the Beat writers. These were things that we were just reading, just kind of scarfing this stuff up. And it kind of set the framework for later questioning. One book which came out during that time, which I still consider a heavy influence on me, is a book called The Nation of Sheep by William Lederer, a little paperback. The Nation of Sheep, that he refers to, William Lederer and Eugene Burdick wrote the classic book, The Ugly American. If you haven't ever read that, I would recommend you reading that to get a sense of the critique of American foreign policy at that time. The Nation of Sheep basically talks about how American people are being fooled by our foreign policy. They're not paying attention. There's a chapter in there on Formosa, which is the other name for Taiwan. I was learning Chinese. I was hoping to get stationed in Formosa, and I was learning that our foreign policy experts were lying to us about what Formosa was like. Chiang Kai-shek was not the big free China Democrat that we thought, that we were told. He was actually repressing most of the population in Taiwan. None of us ever heard that before. I was hearing this while I was in language school in the hope that I was going to eventually go there. So that's an important link for me. Two major events I think during language school I think I want to refer to. Again, that affected my view about the military and about a lot of other things. One, I had a Marine friend, a guy by the name of Tim Cruz. He was studying Thai. He was a corporal in the Marine Corps. And Tim was you thought I was strange. Tim was pretty strange. Tim was an ex-seminarian. He had gone to a Catholic seminary for a while, and then decided to become a Buddhist. Then, keep the steps in mind, he's a seminarian, becomes a Buddhist. Now he decides he's going to go into the Marine Corps because he needs discipline. So he's an ex-seminarian Buddhist joining the Marine Corps for discipline, right? By the time I met him, Tim was pretty well into the Thai program, the Thai language program. He was a corporal already, which is an E4, for those of you who need to know the military stuff. He was not happy being a Marine. Surprise, surprise. He decided that he needed to get out of the military. He began to be more and more sucked into the Thai culture. He really wanted to go to Thailand and just be in Thailand in that Zen kind of way. He refused to follow traditional Marine discipline, which is not good. He was beaten regularly by the other Marines in the barracks there. They would take him up for meetings to one of the rooms, and he would usually come back with a black eye or a bruise on his cheek or some other bruise. Last I heard of him, he had tried a couple of times to go AWOL. Last I heard of him, he'd finally gotten AWOL, but he was caught in Oakland and ended up in a military hospital in Oakland trying to get onto a freighter heading for Thailand. And I never heard anything from him again, so I don't know whatever happened to him. Second story. Another friend of mine, Army this time. Black soldier, guy by the name of George Beasley from Boston. He was studying Chinese. His class, I think, was one class behind mine. George was a really likable guy. Played great classical and jazz piano. He and I used to go around to the bars in Monterey and sit in. I would play drums and he would play piano. I was only 19, so we usually had to watch out for the cops and leave if anybody looked like they were going to come in checking IDs. George was older. He had some college. He returned from one of his holiday breaks married to a white woman. And you would have thought that he committed a major sin. Many of his so-called friends, black and white, turned on him. Last I heard of him, he and his family, he stayed with that family. He and his family moved on. He became a fairly high-level bureaucrat in the State Department, actually running the Chinese language program for Stanford in Taiwan. So haven't been in touch with him for a while, but George was a good friend. But the racism, the military discipline issues for somebody who just didn't belong there, those were things that were bothering me quite a bit at this point. I finished language school in 1963, and I extended. Originally the program was 52 weeks. Too many of my friends were going through 52 weeks of Chinese language program and ending up in places like Japan, Okinawa, someplace other than China, other than Taiwan, other than a place where they could use the language. So I decided to volunteer for an extra 6 months language training. In order to do that, I had to sign a blank check. It's kind of like that dream sheet that I did with the language choices and stuff. I said, okay, I'll trust you. So I signed a blank check. The Navy said, okay, we'll extend you 2 years if, we'll extend your Chinese language program for 6 months if you will sign this blank check. They come back, they said, okay, you're in the extended program and you now owe us 2 more years service. Whoa, like that. Now I was going to be in the Navy for 6 years instead of 4. But I got the 6 months training. I ended up in Taiwan, which is where I wanted to be. The time in Taiwan was significant in many ways. It was my first overseas experience. I got to use the language training that I had, and I got to see the reality of American foreign policy at work in a place that I had already kind of read about a little bit. It was pretty easy for most of us, particularly those of us who had language training in Taiwan, to recognize the tension between the Taiwanese people and the Chinese nationalists. The Chinese nationalists I'm referring to are the people who moved to Taiwan after 1949, after they got kicked out of China. The Taiwanese are the majority of the population in Taiwan. Some Chinese descent, but back to the 14th, 15th century in many ways. So these people are not, they don't necessarily have a high ideological connection or cultural connection with China in many ways. The Taiwanese were suspicious of us, Americans. They were not happy with us because the only reason Chiang Kai-shek was there was because we were there, protecting him and giving him aid. So we were not very popular among the Taiwanese people. For one reason or another, that caused me to be more in favor of the Taiwanese than the Chinese nationalists. So maybe I just wanted to be liked. I wanted to convince people that I was really not a bad person. So I felt more comfortable with the Taiwanese and a lot of us did, than with the Chinese nationalists. As a matter of fact, we were afraid of any of the Chinese nationalists who tried to follow us around. By this time, I had my top secret clearance. I was working at the Naval Security Group. We were doing stuff that the nationalists wanted to find out about because we were spying on them too. It was equal opportunity spying that we did. We spied on the Chinese communists across the strait. We spied on the Chinese nationalists, our hosts. So the Taiwanese were suspicious of us, and we were not. We were not very conscious supporters of the Chinese nationalists as individuals. The other thing that hit me at this time and affects my political awareness, my political movement, was the way that the U.S. military, almost in general, treated the local people. Beating up taxi drivers, using the prostitutes that were widely available in Taiwan at that time. Actually, the prostitute issue was part of official policy. People don't know this, or didn't know this. Mothers at home certainly didn't know this. But we were told by our officers in charge that we were not allowed to develop personal, formal relations with native people, the people that we were there supposedly protecting and serving. Couldn't be friends with families, couldn't be friends with individuals, because we had top secret clearances, and obviously these people were all going to try to squeeze us for information. That was the way it was presented. So the prostitute policy was stated to us by our officer in charge that if you feel the need for some release, use the prostitutes. Don't become friends with anybody locally. But don't go to the same prostitute more than 3 times. Otherwise, you're a security risk. So make sure that you keep track. And this was put very blatantly to us. Of course, by the time this was being expressed to me and to us in our meetings, I had already developed a relationship with a Taiwanese woman. We were going out quite regularly, sneaking around basically because I knew that it would be a problem. And we always went to the Taiwanese parts of town. So we'd go to the movie theaters where no Americans would go. We would go to the bookstores and the restaurants where no Americans would go. Not like I wouldn't stand out, right? But at least we didn't seek out places where Americans were. And that went on for a while. but I'll talk about that a little bit more. While I was in Taiwan, Kennedy was assassinated. John Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. I hadn't gone to church for 2 years up to that point. When Kennedy was assassinated, the only thing I could think of was to go to the base chapel. For some reason. I didn't know why. The women that were working on our base, actually the woman I was going out with was a waitress in one of the clubs on our base. The good jobs were working for the American bases. So that otherwise you had to be a member of the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, and you had to sell your soul to the devil. So they were all in tears for days after that. We were on high alert. Obviously, the president gets shot. All the intelligence services are going to be on high alert. And I went to the chapel because I didn't know what else to do. That was a big experience because Kennedy was a big hero for a lot of us at that time. That begins the process of thinking that Johnson was responsible in some way. A lot of us were suspicious about Johnson. Had to believe that he had something to do with it because we hated Johnson. At this point, I'm reading everything. I'm reading the New Republic. I'm reading the National Review. If you know anything about those magazines, the New Republic at that time was kind of like the liberal side. The National Review was the conservative side. I was just reading. Along with books by Barry Goldwater, conservative politician at this time. I was just starved for information. I didn't know what was happening in the world. This is about the same time that my relationship with Hui Fang, or Linda, becomes known. I was turned in by a friend of mine. That's part of the game. If you're working in the in this intelligence service, you end up realizing that you can't trust anybody, even your best friends. And a lot of the guys had relationships going on at this time, and they were good relationships. Some of the guys actually quit and married the people that they were with. I was pulled in, challenged about this, threatened with immediate removal from the security service if I didn't give her up. They would have sent me to another place that night. I would have disappeared from her life. And again, for one reason or another, I chose her. I chose being with her and giving up the job. It's a pretty cushy job. But I couldn't see the reason for these kinds of policies. Didn't make any sense to me. So I told them where they could put their job, and they sent me off to a temporary duty, which again, 40 years ago this month I was doing this. I was a courier guard for secret documents that were coming into Taiwan on planes. They gave me a .45, taught me how to shoot it for like a half an hour. And they give me this gun, and we go on this plane, and we squire the secret materials in these cartons off this plane. I was there until the orders came through. Orders came through to send me to sea duty. But Linda and I decided that we were going to fight to try to get married before I left, which we did. I took leave there. We managed to get married a day and a half before I was transferred. I fought the United States Navy. I fought the Naval Security Group. I fought the National Security Agency. It was my first experience fighting the bureaucracy like that. They didn't scare me, they just pissed me off. So I was sent to this aircraft carrier in June of 1964. The USS Ticonderoga, World War II class aircraft carrier, built in 1944. There were places on this ship where they would have metal plates on the walls, well, bulkheads. We had to call them bulkheads. We couldn't call them walls. But on the bulkheads, they would have these plates. Kamikaze struck here in 1944. Kamikaze struck here. So we're thinking, oh, this is great. We're on a ship that's been hit like 3 times by kamikaze, and it's still floating, apparently. And every time we went up to speed for air ops, we all thought the ship was going to fall apart. Bolts would come flying out, and stuff like that. We were involved in the Tonkin Gulf incidents. The Tonkin Gulf in 1964, the famous Tonkin Gulf incidents. This was probably the main turning point. All of these things that are happening up to this point are beginning to get me ready to make major change in my views. This was it. The people who were on the USS Maddox, that was supposedly minding its own business, sailing along, in the international waters off the coast of North Vietnam, the people on board the Maddox were friends of mine from the Naval Security Group on Taiwan. They were Chinese linguists, they were Vietnamese linguists, they were people that were there spying on North Vietnam. I knew what they were doing, but I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know until a few days after the events who these people were. But once I discovered who they were and what they were doing, then I realized, okay, presidents lie. Now my students, when I tell my students this, they all laugh, because everybody knows the presidents lie now. But in 1964, we didn't think the presidents lied. Nobody ever told us the presidents lied. We just, in the security service, we just didn't tell everybody the truth. We didn't lie, we just didn't tell them all the information. It was a convenient kind of distinction. But when President Johnson told everybody that our ships were attacked in international waters, and I knew otherwise, that caused me to ask some questions. What was this about? Why were they doing this? Why was he lying? Why wasn't he telling the truth? That was in August, September of 1964. I began asking these questions. Now the questions didn't go deep enough. I started looking into the history of Vietnam and stuff like that, but the questions didn't go deep enough, or maybe they went too deep. But in November of that year, that's election year, at this point I was 21 years old, and I could vote. It was my first election. Remember? Now, in those days, you had to be 21 to vote. I voted for Barry Goldwater, the conservative, the extreme conservative, the guy who wanted to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam, the guy who opposed civil rights legislation. Now, why the hell I did that? I have in my notes here, what the fuck. Why I did that, I don't know. I still don't know. I still try to explain that. A part of it, I think, was, as a rationalization, part of it was just I hated Johnson because he was not Kennedy. And maybe in the back of my mind, I hoped that Goldwater wouldn't win anyhow, so at least I was voting for somebody. And I didn't know if there was anybody else to vote for. So we'll leave it at that. But that's one of those weird little things that pops up in your life story that sometimes you don't want to talk about. By December, however, by December '64, I knew I opposed the war in Vietnam as an attempt to work our will on a whole people. This goes back to my throwback to my feelings about how the military was treating people in Asia anyhow. It all fit together at this point. I didn't know what I could or should do about it. I just knew I opposed it. By this time, I was working in another part of the ship. I was working in the ship's library and a chaplain's assistant, strangely enough. From December of '64 to June of '65, our ship was in dry dock in San Francisco. I was against the war at this point. I was wearing the uniform every day. I kept my shoes shined, my hair cut. Everything was shipshape. I didn't talk a lot about things that might get me in trouble. But in San Francisco at that period, what was happening then? Free speech movement at Berkeley. Boy, I wanted to be at Berkeley. I didn't want to be on this ship. I was reading everything, and I mean everything at this point. I used to freak out the black Muslims because there was this one bus stop. I would get off at this one bus stop from work each day because I'm wearing my uniform. I'd get off the bus, and the Nation of Islam people were there selling Muhammad Speaks. I think it was a dime at that point or something. I would always buy a copy from this guy in his bow tie and stuff. And they were freaked. They didn't know what to do. This white guy in a Navy uniform buying Muhammad Speaks. I was reading Muhammad Speaks. I was reading one book after The Nation of Sheep, a book that influenced me that begins to help me open up a little bit in terms of understanding foreign policy. William Appleman Williams' Tragedy of American Foreign Policy. I read that in San Francisco in 1965, and I began to understand. It began to make sense to me. Now again, 1965. At this point, I not only extended 2 years in the Navy, but while I was in Taiwan, I extended another year. So in 1965, I've still got 3 more years to do in the Navy. And I've got to keep myself out of jail if I can. Reading Ramparts magazine. Ramparts magazine was probably one of the main left-wing journals at that time. It started off as a Catholic liberal journal out of Pope John the 23rd stuff. It became a political journal, and I was reading that, and I was getting more and more vocal in what I thought. My wife and I were there in San Francisco. She got pregnant at that time, and I knew that I was going to have to go back to Southeast Asia. I was going back to Vietnam soon. I was hoping that it would happen before. It wouldn't happen before a child was born. During this period in San Francisco, I was also talking to shipmates about the war on the ship, about the origins. I was ordering stuff for the ship's library. Every book I could find in the Department of the Navy supply catalog that had the word Vietnam in it, I ordered. Our ship's library was the best Vietnam library they had in the Navy, I'm sure. Bernard Falls, the Two Vietnams, I read that. I learned about the Geneva Accords. This was all public information that people could have known about. But I was reading about this. I couldn't wait to get the hell out of the military at this point. I wanted to get out of the military and do something to change U.S. policies in Asia. Not in a radical way. As a matter of fact, a letter I wrote to, they were trying to, they had a retention plan, a retention task force in the Navy. They were trying to figure out how to keep people in. And in August of 1965, I wrote them a letter saying why I'm not staying in. And part of it is it's describing, the way I saw military treating people overseas. Toward the end here, I said, well, I want to work on my own as a civilian, as an individual American and his family. And that way I won't have to feel the embarrassment, any embarrassment by wearing a uniform that unfortunately represents ignorance, ill manners, excessive behavior patterns, and all the other traits that are commonly associated with U.S. servicemen. I'm proud of my country and I would like to be proud of my uniform, but I cannot be so as long as it represents these traits to so many people whom I would like to count among my finest friends. So I wrote this to the Secretary of the Navy Task Force explaining why I wasn't going to stay in. I guess they were probably happy that I made that decision not to stay in. In September of '65, we were sent back to Southeast Asia. My wife was pregnant, as I said. The baby was due in October. That was the stated due date. So I was not going to be there when my daughter would be born. I didn't know I was going to have a daughter, but that's what it ended up being. As a matter of fact, well, I'll tell that story in a little bit. We went back to Southeast Asia. The war was hotter and hotter. There are now 3 carriers on duty when there used to be 2. So 2 in the north, 1 in the south. Air operations were more intense. We were losing people. Pilots were dying by accidents. We were losing weapons over the side. This didn't come out until 1989, but one of our planes that didn't quite make it when they tried to land one time went over the side and sunk. And that plane was armed with 2 nuclear weapons. And in 1989, it was admitted that those nuclear weapons are down in the Pacific somewhere off the coast of Okinawa. Air operations was our entertainment, those of us who didn't have to work in hardcore jobs. So we'd see the planes take off, we'd see the planes land lighter than they were when they took off. You began to think about where those bombs were going and what was happening. If you were thinking about the war at all, it was not a place to be. There was a lot of stuff that happened during that period from September 65 to December. I was on that ship, stuck off the coast of probably North Vietnam at this point, and I didn't know what was happening with my wife. I knew the baby was going to be born at some point. But here it was, it was November 19th, and I hadn't heard anything yet. Then I got a telegram. Telegram finally got through. The telegram was sent on November 12th, so I got it a week later. My wife had a baby. We had a daughter, Lisa, sitting back there. I told her I was going to embarrass her. So I was stuck out in the middle of nowhere, basically, when she was born. I didn't get to see her until I got off that ship. I was transferred off the ship in February of '66. By the time I met Lisa, she was 3 months old. That didn't make me very happy. And I was against the war. So I was against the war. Everything was falling apart. But I was now no longer in that area. Now I was no longer in Southeast Asia. I was home now. And that was a good thing. My mother thought it was a good thing. My mother said, now I don't have to think about the war. Now you're home. I don't have to worry about it. We had a big argument that day. Because I told her that people were still fighting and dying over there. And the fact that I wasn't there didn't make any difference. We still had to stop the war. I was writing letters home at this point. By 1966, 65, 66, I was writing letters very subtly, even to see the letters, but talking about how I thought the war was wrong. I didn't tell them everything I thought. My mother didn't know why I had changed. And from my point of view, I hadn't changed. I basically was still had the same values that they raised me with. I was just able to see through the phoniness about these things now. I was sent to Florida, helicopter training squadron. That squadron was, all the people going through that program were probably going to end up being pilots in Vietnam. All of the instructors were combat veterans from Vietnam, Marine and Navy instructors. My desk was an anti-war memorial. I had anti-war posters on my desk. I had anti-war cartoons, slogans, all kinds of stuff. Books about Karl Marx on my desk. These are things, and they had to come through this office. This was the executive officer's office. But here again, kept my uniform clean, kept my shoes shine, kept my hair cut, and they couldn't say much to me. They could say things, but as long as I was doing my job, they couldn't do a lot to me. But I was much more vocal at that point. Getting a little braver, because I was, first of all, I was with my family. Second of all, I was ready to get out. I didn't have much more time in the service. By 1967, I had joined the American Civil Liberties Union. I had joined the American Servicemen's Union, which was kind of like this weak attempt to organize the military. I was subscribing to every underground newspaper I could find. Berkeley Barb, East Village Other, Chicago Seed, you name it. Every underground paper, the weirder the better. And they were all coming to me through the base post office. Very often I would get them a week or two late. And then I found out that those guys in the post office were reading them before I got them. So maybe that's kind of like an extra little bit of organizing that was going on, I guess. The underground press was where you got your news at that point, especially in the military. I was reading SDS publications. I was reading the Port Huron Statement, Students for Democratic Society, for those of you who don't know. I was reading everything. I was trying to find out what was going on out in the real world as much as I could. I would get into arguments with some of the Navy and Marine pilots that would come through my office and see my desk, and they would be a little upset. But I knew my stuff. I was able to talk, and they couldn't do anything to me as long as I was doing my job. Speaking of jobs, at that point I had a part-time job. After hours, I was working at Sears as an account interviewer. I had that job until just before Christmas of 1967. Then all of a sudden they decided they didn't need me anymore, right at the Christmas rush. A Marine friend of mine, he worked there in that office as well. A Marine friend of mine told me that the FBI and the Office of Naval Intelligence had been coming around, asking questions about me. I was very vocal at work. A lot of the women that worked in that office were wives of people in the military. And they didn't take too kindly to me talking about the war and speaking against it. And I wasn't the only one talking about it, but Oh, I did get a letter published. In March of 1967, I wrote this letter. I was pissed off because the local newspaper was challenging Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy by this time had turned against the Vietnam War, and this newspaper challenged him on it. Said it was a political manipulation, all this kind of stuff. So I wrote this rather lengthy letter, typed it on my machine at work, actually, over lunch, sent it to the newspaper, and everything was going to get published. They published it, and this newspaper publishes your letters with your address. And I didn't identify myself as a military guy when I sent this in. If you want to come look at it sometime afterwards, the little squiggles down here is little sketches and drawing lines here. That's my daughter's first editing job. She decided to draw on it. So that letter plus my vocal discussion about the war, I kind of linked up with some pseudo hippies in there at that time who had a LSD church organized. Never took drugs, but they were fun. And joining the civil liberties, all that kind of stuff. These were symbols for people that I was a problem, and so they decided to follow me, and I lost that job. I finally was discharged in February 1968. Actually, 2 months early. So I served 6 years, 10 months in the Navy. Honorable discharge. First thing I did when I got home to Chicago, my family home, was enroll in school, Circle Campus in Chicago. Enrolled there in March of 1968, got a job with the Chicago Daily News in March of 1968. So I was working full-time at the Chicago Daily News overnight, going to school full-time during the day. In April 1968, April 27th, my wife and I attended our first anti-war demonstration. April 27th, 1968. I still have the button for it. This was a march that was attacked by the Chicago cops. It was seen as a dry run for them for their later actions in August in the Chicago Democratic Convention. From this point on, my wife and I, and sometimes my daughter, attended every demonstration against the war that we could while we were living in that area. Also, 1968, Martin Luther King gets assassinated. Chicago blew up. I was going to school at that point. Black students stopped traffic on Halsted Street, and basically stopped classes that day. And a lot of neighborhoods were in flames during that period. Martin Luther King gets killed in April. Robert Kennedy gets killed in June. I was working overnight at the Chicago Daily News when the announcement that Kennedy died came through. This was about 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning our time. I called my dad because he was going to vote for Kennedy, as I was that year. My dad's response was, "Oh shit." He ended up voting for Nixon that year. I voted for Dick Gregory. Chicago police in August '68, pushed me further and further to the left. I began, like a lot of people, began looking at revolutionary models, began looking at China, began looking at Cuba, reading Che Guevara, Mao, all of these things. I mean, there had to be other answers. There had to be things beyond what our experience was here to help us out. I was attracted to, I was a quote-unquote member of the Students for Democratic Society, which was kind of easy to be. You didn't even have to send them any money, but I did. I sent them money and I wore my button. The Black Panther Party in Chicago was an important element for us at that time. Fred Hampton was a great hero of mine in Chicago at that time. They were developing cross-national unity groups. They were organizing the Black Panthers along with the Young Patriots, which was a poor white group on the north side, near north side. The Young Lords, which is a Puerto Rican group. It was the first Rainbow Coalition, and Fred Hampton was effective in that. Between 1969 and 72, SDS split. SDS didn't make any sense to me anymore. One of my workmates at the newspaper was a member of the Young Socialist Alliance, which is a Trotskyist organization, Trotskyist youth group. he began asking me very embarrassing questions about China that I couldn't answer. So I started looking into Trotskyism. I read Trotsky's My Life. That was a pretty influential thing for me. The murder of Fred Hampton by the Chicago police with the help of the FBI in 1969, December 4th, 1969, was an important thing for me. That showed how rough it could get if you were trying to do the right thing. The house where he was murdered was kept open for about a week, so people could be taken on a tour through it. I went through that. I drove over there after work one day in the morning and went through that. The Chicago conspiracy trial, the Chicago 8, then the Chicago 7, after Bobby Seale was removed. Went to every demonstration that was outside the federal building about that. Just had to be part of all of these things, had to participate in whatever way I could. But again, keep in mind, I'm working full-time and I'm going to school full-time at this point. I'm still doing that. Plus fitting these in between, plus trying to take care of my kids, when I was awake. In 1970 in Chicago, I joined Vietnam Veterans Against the War. It took me, VVAW started in 1967, but they didn't really start picking up a lot of members until 68 or 69. In Chicago, I finally joined VVAW, and I've been a member ever since. Also in 1970, after Kent State and Jackson State, I participated in the student strike at Circle Campus. We shut the campus down for 10 days. We didn't. The president actually closed it, so we didn't have to we wasn't forced to shut it down. Circle Campus, and this is UIC, I guess that's what they call it now, University of Illinois Chicago. We call it Circle Campus. It will always be Circle Campus. That was Strike Central in Chicago. That was where all the organizing for all of the universities and colleges around Strike the Chicago area, that was where it was all done. The architecture building at UIC was where they made all the posters, put out all the leaflets and everything like this. Every school in the city was on strike or doing some kind of anti-war work at that time, including the seminaries. There was a seminary I used to pass on the way home every day that had bed sheets hanging out of their windows after Kent State, about the war. There are groups I'm going to mention that you won't necessarily know. I worked with the National Peace Action Coalition, which is one of the major coalitions around the war. The Committee to End the War in Vietnam, which was basically a campus-based organization. As a VVAW member, I participated in all the actions that they put forward. We went major demonstrations at Great Lakes Naval Training Center, which was kind of weird. In 1971, 10 years later, 10 years after I was there as a recruit, here we are at Great Lakes, outside the fence, trying to talk people into quitting. Don't do it, don't do it. O'Hare Airport in December of 1971. In fall of 1971, there was a bill in Congress that I think it was McGovern-Hatfield bill, if it had passed, it would have cut off the appropriations for the Vietnam War and would have forced the troops home by New Year's Eve in 1971. Well, we all knew that wasn't going to pass, and VVAW had meetings, some very entertaining meetings, to talk about what they would do about it locally. We ended up at O'Hare Airport on New Year's Eve, 1971, passing out flyers to people coming off the planes, telling people that if that had passed, the people coming off those planes would have been Vietnam vets coming home safe. That was pretty intense. We didn't get any hassles by the airport security at that time. Don't think you could do that today. I got to talk about another demonstration, April 24th, 1971. People may be reading about all the stuff with John Kerry and Dewey Canyon and all that stuff. I don't know if you are or not, but that week before April 24th was Vietnam Veterans Against the War had a week-long series of demonstrations in Washington, D.C. Now, I didn't participate in those. I was in Chicago. My wife had gone home in March of '71. Her father passed away, and she had just come back around this time. And so I was at home. We're taking care of my daughter. My parents were helping to share the load there. But my wife had just come home, and so I wasn't going on in Washington. But there was a big demo in Chicago on April 24th, part of the national demonstration. It's kind of like what's going to happen here on March 20th this year. There's going to be citywide demonstrations around the 1-year anniversary of the war in Iraq. April 24th, 1971, we brought our daughter along. She was, at that point, 5 years old. So she was, and we didn't want to have her walk, so we brought the carriage, and the little stroller thing. So she was strolling, and we're marching along State Street. Tens of thousands of people, huge demonstration. Shouting off the top of our lungs, 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your fucking war. Ho, 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 Chi Minh, the NLF is going to win. All the standard stuff. It was just bouncing off the buildings. It was pretty intense. That was on a Saturday. The next day, after church, I was still going to church at this point, we went over to my folks' place for dinner, for Sunday dinner, which was kind of like a tradition. And I still have this picture in my head. I could be wrong about some of the images. But my daughter, I believe, is wearing a nice frilly little girl's dress, probably with white tights or something. And she's in my parents' living room, having a grand old time, shouting out loud as she possibly could. 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your fucking war. Over and over and over again. My parents were appalled. Oh, my mother was appalled. My father thought it was funny. But that's part of it too. I raised my kids right. Basically, from this point, I mean, the seeds of all the activism basically have been set at this point. I've got 20 more pages of notes I could go through. No, not really. But between 1972 and now, 1972 started graduate school. My son was born in January 1972. We moved down here, started graduate school. While I was down here, I was campus organizer for the Young Socialist Alliance for a year, from 73 to 74. I also helped organize a small local chapter of the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars, which was a small group that, actually it was a big group nationally, but since 1968 they had done much to help discredit U.S. policies in Asia, and we had a chapter here. I worked with the Asian American Student Alliance at that point, a group of progressive students working against the war, and then when the war was over, continuing that work against racism on campus, anti-Asian racism. This is in the 1970s. They actually were very important in the coalition to help establish La Casa here on campus. The Asian American students were very politically active during that period. As a graduate student and a teaching assistant, I began to work with, in the early efforts to organize graduate students, to unionize graduate students. We had what we call the Assistants Union, AU, while we're our little buttons and stuff. It didn't have any impact whatsoever. Continued to identify with Vietnam Veterans Against the War, although in graduate school I didn't have an awful lot of time or contact with them. While I was here in graduate school, the Trotskyism side of things becomes, obviously the YSA and all that stuff, that becomes important. While I was here, I met, as part of my graduate program, I was trying to figure out what to do for a PhD in political science. And I thought that a PhD project on Chinese Trotskyism might be worth doing. First of all, nobody had done it except one other person, and his was shit. I could do better. So I decided I would do that. I met 2 Chinese revolutionaries. They were living in California at the time, although nobody knew that they were living in California at the time. I had to tell everybody they were living in Paris. But they were living in LA, actually. 2 Chinese revolutionaries who had been basically forced out of China because they were too revolutionary even for Mao. A man by the name of Peng Shuzhi and his wife Chen Vilan. They had been founding members of the Chinese Communist Party in the 1920s in China. They became part of the Chinese Trotskyist movement, and without going into a lot of detail, the Trotskyist movement had to split off from the main movement, and A lot of them ended up in jail. Some of these people were put in jail in China for 27 years. Were only released in 1979. But I met these two people, and I decided to do a PhD on those two revolutionaries. And they were great supports for me. Over 10 years, we had a regular relationship, letters, and I met with them a few times. They showed me what you could do if you stuck it out. They were in their 80s at this point, and they were still revolutionaries. They were still fighting. They hadn't given up yet. After my PhD, I went to Australia with my family, joined the Australian Socialist Workers' Party, continuing the Trotskyist theme. That's where I learned a lot about real mass organizing, not the kind of phony mass organizing that a lot of people were doing here. Worked on solidarity work. There was a committee in support of Central America and the Caribbean I was a member of. I was a founding member of the Australia-Cuba Friendship Society. I'm very proud of that. And I worked with the Australia-Vietnam Society. Returned to the U.S. in '83, got back connected with the VVAW, moved here in 1988, joined the PRC. Jeff and I spent a horrible one summer, coming up with the Progressive Resource Action Cooperative name. Can't believe how
Jim was there too.
Yeah, what a struggle that was. And I continue to do what I can in trying to make change in this country. So, in this country and around the world. So, I'm going to finish off with a couple of lines that Peng Shuji wrote in my notebook. When I first met him, I actually cut it out and taped it in my little book here. Two Chinese phrases, and I won't say them in Chinese, but basically the translation is, to go nobly to one's death is easy. To struggle for the long term is difficult. And this was written in a notebook by a guy who's already well into his 80s and had not given up the struggle yet. So I'll end there. I know I went on longer than I thought I would. Does anybody have any questions? I left a lot of holes open. So. Yeah?
What other events really turned you off? You mentioned that you see planes coming back.
And again, as I said, on the carrier, we would lose pilots to just accidents. And because we were doing wartime activity in what was nominally a peacetime Navy, they weren't, they were victims of that, And then because I had had some experience in Asia, in Taiwan at least, and we traveled to Japan, and we traveled to the Philippines, and I could see how people resented us and resented our being there. And I'm not talking about the governments. The governments always liked us being there because we kept them in power. The average people didn't want us there. They didn't like us there. And once you start thinking about that, you start realizing that you're not making friends, you're making enemies. Yeah.
What's your take on how things are going today? I mean, with regard to activism in the current administration of the war in Iraq and all of that?
I'm impressed because when you think about it, the major demonstrations against the Vietnam War, if you think of the first big demonstration in April of 1965, 25,000 people in Washington, D.C. The war had been going on since 1950, basically. Our part in it since 1954 or 55, right? The first major troop involvement, not official troops, but advisors, 1961. So it took 4 years for 25,000 people to get in the streets, right? Well, if you think about last spring, before the war even starts, you've got millions of people in this country, millions of people around the world. And within this past year, there's been more stuff coming out about the war that they're running scared, I believe. Okay? And unfortunately, in that period, we've lost nearly 600 Americans at this point, plus Allied soldiers and so on. Not to mention, what's it up to? The estimate is up to like 10,000 Iraqis, maybe, or more. So the activism, I think, is, I'm impressed with the speed of the activism. I mean, that happened during the first Gulf War, too. It seems like with each successive war, and hopefully we won't have too many more after this, with each successive war, people activate themselves quicker. There's more information out there. There's more, there's more organization, I think, going on. So I'm pretty optimistic about that. Anybody else? And also, I have to probably give some thanks to John Kerry for, VVAW's got a whole new lease on life. We're getting more hits, more negative and positive hits now than we've had in almost decades. And we're too old for this, but we're still doing it. Any other questions? About anything? Anything that
Well, here, Joe, on what you're just talking about, so the issue of Vietnam is all over the place again.
Yeah, that's right.
So what does Vietnam Veterans Against the War think about that today, and how would you comment on John Kerry, on Bush, on their records? It's all of a sudden an issue again. Vietnam is in the front pages.
Sure, and people want us to rewrite history. VVAW has nothing to apologize for. The positions we took on Vietnam in the late 1960s and early 1970s were correct. They've been proven correct. There are people who want to deny the reality. They want to deny, for their own reasons, they want to deny the reality. So Bush is in the National Guard, maybe. We know where Kerry was. We've got photographic proof. We don't need to look for Dunno records. And Kerry came out. He's taken a lot of shit for coming out and opposing his war. Well, that's what all of us did in VVAW. VVAW was organized during the war in 1967. It's the first time that's ever happened historically. There is not another veterans organization I'm aware of that organized itself around its war while that war was going on. And people now want to challenge us as being real vets. Well, I'm not a combat vet, but I'm a Vietnam vet. I've got the Vietnam Service medal just like everybody else did. Combat vets are I'm one of the national coordinators. We've got 5 national coordinators. The other 4 are all combat vets. And at the height of VVAW's existence in the early 70s, we had somewhere around 25 to 30,000 members, and 75% of those people were combat vets. That's a reality, And why can't they prove it? Why, there's a lot of controversy about the Winter Soldier investigation, the people who testified they weren't really vets and all this kind of stuff. Sure, they were vets. We weren't going to cooperate with the police and with the Naval Investigative Service and turn over their names and their stories and contact information in the Nixon years. Come on. We're not going to cooperate with the cops on those kinds of things. If they couldn't find out this stuff on their own, fuck them. That's my attitude. So we weren't cooperating. That's what makes people angry now. We weren't cooperating then. We're not cooperating now. We're still angry young men. So I hope that answered your question. Any other questions? Come on, I got so much more. I could go for hours. Yeah.
It does seem like when I talk to people now, there's a lot of people who don't see war as political. They see when your country's at war, it's whether or not you support your country. And no one should oppose the war, no matter what the war. When you were organizing, what did you do in that situation?
Well, for one thing, during the Vietnam War, I want to say it was fairly easy. And in many ways it was, because you had a mass movement against that war. There was a social context against that war that was pretty easy organizing. One thing that people don't remember about the Vietnam War is that when we were marching, the first demonstration I went to in Chicago in April of 1968, the sign I was carrying, "Support our troops, bring them home now." That's what we were organizing around. We were organizing around saving people's lives. And the people who want to say, shut your mouth, let's let them fight the war and die, are not supporting those troops. And the president is not supporting those troops by sending them off to die, especially since he wasn't willing to put himself on the line. But, you know, veterans can argue that point, I think, a little more effectively, you know, and that's unfortunate. You know, so you have to have, like, the proof, you have to have the paper, you know, to the credentials to make this argument. But, you know, I don't buy that in general. You know, people can think for themselves, and there's a tradition in this country, although we were not always taught it, of opposition to every war we've been in. There's always been opposition to wars. Go all the way back to the Revolutionary War, right? So, you know, people who want to, you know, just shut down and, you know, close their brains down during a war, they're being unpatriotic in my view, and they're certainly not supporting the people that are on putting their lives on the line. To answer. Yeah.
What's your favorite story from the first Gulf War?
My favorite story from the first Gulf War? The mass demonstration that we walked into on the quad, that with you and Jim and, you know, these people just kind of holding the line. Yeah, let me tell that story, because there's people here who haven't heard that. The first Gulf War, we had organizing on this campus and organizing in this room, actually. We were having meetings every week of, 100, 200 people in this room, organizing meetings. We had 2 demonstrations a week in the build-up to the war, every Wednesday and every Saturday. Every Wednesday we had a demonstration on the quad, every Saturday we had a demonstration in downtown Urbana. We were very highly organized, Committee Against the War in the Gulf. We had a veterans caucus inside that group, which I was part of organizing that. Like World War II vets, Korean vets, Vietnam vets, Terry Thiel from Beirut, Marine vet, was part of that. The plan was that once the war started, and you could tell from what Bush 1 was saying that they already had the war in mind, they were ready to go. Once the war started, we had an emergency response situation. So the day after the war, the day after bombing started, we had a plan to march from downtown Champaign, to march all the way down Green Street to the quad. Nice plan. It was a nice plan. We had about, 1,200 people, 1,500 people marching. We had to march on the sidewalks because we couldn't get permits. We had to cross the street with the lights because the cops wouldn't stop the traffic with us, and there were people trying to drive into our members as people were crossing the street. We had security all along the route, and we had a brave security crew on the quad protecting the stage. I think it was a stage. Was it a platform of some sort? I seem to remember a platform of some sort. And I was supposed to speak with that thing. I have to tell you, I didn't do any public speaking until October 1990. That was my first anti-war speech. I never made speeches. I was just one of the guys that organized stuff and, you know, pass out things and stuff. I never spoke. So I was going to speak at this rally. We got to the quad and we discovered that the place was under siege. There were a few hundred drunk, ROTC, frat people, as I remember. I remember a lot of flags. They were waving a lot of flags. And they were trying to sing the Star Spangled Banner, but they didn't know the words.
You were too drunk to know the tune,
Oh,
too.
there was, yeah. So we marched around the quad to try to give the security folks, and I remember Dorothy and Jim, I remember the look on Jim's face when we got to that stage. He had this big grin on his face. Like, isn't this fun? We got to finally got to the stage, and we had our rally. And that was exciting. It was powerful because we knew we had done the organizing work. We prepared for it. We had people who were on the ground who knew what to do. And that's one of the great things about living in this town. There are people in this town who know how to organize stuff and who know what's necessary. And a lot of it gets done here. And it's pretty important work to continue with. But that's one of the highlights that I remember. And then once the ground war started, everybody was kind of depressed, but we still had fun. Anybody else have anything? Aaron, looks like you keep on raising your hand. Go ahead.
You
you mentioned the actions that are coming up on March 20th.
Right.
There's the big one in Chicago. Do you want to elaborate on that? Maybe suggest
I wish I could. The only thing we know right now, I'm hoping we'll have more information this weekend, is that they're planning, these are national demonstrations. It would be in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, DC possibly. But these are organized demonstrations in major cities and some local communities, and to commemorate the 1-year anniversary of the war in Iraq. And I think a lot of people from here are planning on going up to Chicago. VVAW is organizing a contingent up in Chicago, and hopefully people will join us in that contingent.
You might be able to find out more information from Aware.
Yeah, I don't think anybody has any details yet. You know, it's all kind of, you know, we just know it's going to happen, but we don't know, like, there is an issue going on with permits and stuff, I think. So that's always the issue. That's always the sticking point. Anything else? One thing I should mention, speaking of Aware, there's an Aware event taking place on April 1st at the Champaign Public Library. The mother of one of the soldiers who was killed in Iraq is speaking, and actually she shared the platform with Barry Romoff in Chicago not too long ago. She's speaking, and I've been invited to speak there too, so hopefully I won't speak as much. She'll have more things to say. Anything else, folks?
Joe, do you have any figures yet on conscientious objectors of Iraq War?
Current?
Military conscientious?
Not hearing much about conscientious objectors, hearing a lot about soldiers with stress, hearing a lot about suicides. There's one case you and I were talking about earlier, Deidre Cobb, who's a Urbana native, joined the military, I guess a year or so ago, and ended up last spring, just as the war was going to start, deciding that she really didn't want to be in the military anymore. And so she was filing for conscientious objector status, which I think was denied. I think she's still in a kind of a holding situation, probably on the East Coast somewhere. She's not in jail, not in the stockade, but they're not letting her go. But you usually don't hear a lot about those stories, until later. There was there were more visible conscientious objectors during the first Gulf War, I think, than this one. Part of it, I think, also this one, at least at the start, had a lot more public support. There was a lot of, the whole weapons of mass destruction thing and all that. People were willing to just kind of shut their eyes and hope for the best. Now I think there's more questions. So you're probably going to be seeing more. And guys who are coming home for their 2-week breaks, not everybody's going back. Some of them are just disappearing.
Well, there was an article recently by the National Council on Conscientious Objection. It said that they didn't have any hard figures, but it was somewhere over 50,000 military people assigned for conscientious objection.
Could be, yeah. I haven't seen that. I haven't followed that closely. I wouldn't be surprised. Any other questions? Did I tell you enough stories? Oh, there's more. Let me tell you about Bob Hope. I can't let this one off. Okay, I'm going to tell you about Bob Hope. I kind of ran by this one because I thought I was running out of time, but no, I've got time. The Bob Hope Show, the Christmas show. You might have some vague notion. Bob Hope used to go around Christmas time and entertain the troops and stuff, right? He came to our ship in December of 1965, actually December 26th, as I checked my notes. December 26, 1965, he landed on the carrier. First time he ever did a Christmas show on a Navy ship, at sea. We were at sea. That was actually the first time that's the only time I ever saw Vietnam. I'm a Vietnam veteran who never saw Vietnam. I only saw Vietnam because we had to go in close enough so that the helicopters didn't have to fly so far out with the troop and the band stuff and all that stuff. So 5 miles away, I could see Cam Ranh Bay. Oh, there's Vietnam. Bob Hope Troop comes on board. They do a full-out show. They only show you the 1-hour clips and all this kind of stuff. We had like 4 hours of Bob Hope on our ship because they're putting the show together as you're going, right? The cue cards are falling down and people are, making mistakes and stuff. The thing about the Bob Hope show, we were excited about it. It was a break. 2/3 of the crew, 2/3 of the ship's crew was off duty and sitting on the flight deck. Fortunately, the weather was good. Sitting on the flight deck for this show. We didn't have to do any work, which was a plus. Thank you, Bob Hope. We didn't have to do any work. He comes on. He's got the standard, the big band, West Band, and the Band of Renown, and I think Miss USA was traveling with him. Carol Baker, our actress, was traveling with him. Joey Heatherton, who was probably the most popular member of the troupe. She was a becoming famous dancer at that point, but she was the main attraction. And we were on the deck, and he's doing this thing for 4 hours, and he's making these jokes. He must have thought that he was entertaining our fathers. He was making jokes about the Beatles. We were all Beatles fans. He was slamming the Beatles. He was making jokes about the draft dodgers, which he thought, I'm assuming, would have gotten big play. The people I was sitting with were muttering, wow, I wish I was one of those draft dodgers. I wish I wasn't here and I was there. He was not making the points that he thought he was going to make. We were just having a good time just being off of work and seeing a show. Those of us who could see from the distance that we were at. But it was just lame. He was not entertaining the people he thought he was entertaining. And when you see pictures of Bob Hope's shows later on in the war, this was in 1965, in the background, some of these photos, you can see these huge peace signs being held up in the back. These are GIs in the field. These are not Navy guys sailing 60 miles off the coast. These are GIs in the field holding peace signs up at Bob Hope shows in major areas where they were being attacked. So he wasn't quite doing it the way he thought he was going to do it. So that was an interesting time. My family was all pleased that I got film of Joey Heatherton and all that. I was pleased I got film of Joey Heatherton. Anything else? See if you get me talking long enough. I can just go on and on. That's what happens when you're in your 60s.
Joey mentioned he stopped going to church at some point. Why was that?
Why? Didn't mean anything anymore. It was partially hypocrisy. The church we were going to, this is when my family and I were back in the Chicago area. We were living out in Des Plaines at that point. The church we were going to, for a while, had this young priest who would harangue the congregation with sermons about civil rights, about racial justice, things like this. And this is in the northwest suburb of Chicago. He was not very popular. People would get up and walk out on him and stuff. And I was not angry at him. I was angry at the fact that people weren't ready for that. My heroes were, I've talked about this, my heroes were people like Father James Groppe, the radical priest in Milwaukee who was fighting open housing, for open housing laws in Milwaukee. The Berrigan brothers, those were the Catholics that I identified with, not Mel Gibson. The Catholics I identified with were the people who were breaking through the old Catholicism. And I just didn't see it making major changes. I didn't see any point in going to church anymore. It was more important to be at the next demonstration than it was to go to church on Sunday. My kids, my son wasn't born at this point. He fortunately escaped all of this. My daughter, at the time, we were taking her to church, and then my sister, who was married to a Japanese American who is Buddhist, they would then take her to Buddhist temple services. So she was going to Catholic services, poor kid. She was going to Catholic services and then going to Buddhist temple. She probably enjoyed the Buddhist temple services more. I think they were more fun. But it wasn't meaningful anymore.
What kept you going originally?
Well, part of it was getting married. I could not see getting married without getting married in church. which was kind of weird because the Catholic chaplain, the Navy chaplain, because you had to go through this process of you're marrying a foreigner. You had to go through this process. You had to jump all through all these hoops. One of the hoops was to get to be interviewed by the Catholic chaplain. The Catholic chaplain told me this should have decided it. He told me that it was race mixing and that it was a sin to marry outside your race. I just walked out and I got married by a Catholic missionary, a French-Canadian missionary in Taipei who could speak Taiwanese better than any native Taiwanese I ever heard. And he married us in their church. So I didn't get married by a Catholic chaplain. But, it was kind of like, that was expected. It was kind of like what you did. If you're going to get married, you get married in church. It's almost like an amendment that they want to pass now. It was just the expectations. But the more the war went on, the more radical I was becoming, the less important that kind of institution meant to me. And I saw more hypocrisy there than anything else. You just missed another story.
Oh, well.
Anything else? We can go till 9. I have no problem. Well, if not, then I will thank you for your attention. Thank you for your endurance. And hope I didn't bore you. All I would say at the end would be, those of you who have not thought about activism as part of your life, think about it in whatever way you can. You don't have to. I'm not a David Dellinger. I'm not a Barry Romo. I'm not one of those people that there are visions of what activists are that I think are unrealistic. All of us are potentially activists as long as you see something wrong and you're willing to do what you can to make that better. And it doesn't make any difference what it is. We're not heroes. This is not a competition. If you see something wrong, you should do something about it whenever you can. And don't be afraid. There's not a hell of a lot they can do to you here. So, thank you again. Good night.